What's new?
I'm Zeb Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. Today I'm with somebody who really doesn't need an introduction. It's Professor Hasia Diner. I'll give her an introduction anyway. Professor Diner is the Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at NYU, one of the pillars of American Jewish history. Somebody in her career has changed the field, has made us think about new paradigms, and has inspired us all, whether that we work in the 18th, 19th, or 20th century. Hasia, you have done it all.
Thank you.
As a model scholar and a senior colleague.
Okay, well, thank you. It's a lovely introduction.
So this segment is called What's New? And I want to go back to 2016, I believe it was, when you published your book, Roads Taken, which was, it's hard to believe, was the first full-length, book-length treatment of Peddler life in the 19th century. My intuition and my reading of your work suggests that this was a book a long time in the making, and you had worked, it progressed from your earlier work to that point. But I thought that we could address, number one, some of the questions you asked and answered in that book, and how that, what questions are there? What areas in the field are now fertile to till?
Okay, so I think what this book probably had its origins in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I agreed to write that second volume in the
Johns Hopkins series.
The Johns Hopkins University Press.
Your book, Time for Gathering.
Yeah, and I actually did not want to write that book. I mean, I wanted to write one of the books, but I really wanted the 1880, 1920, because that's obviously the really good and juicy stuff, and it's the East Europeans and labor and strikes and radicalism and all that. And by the time I got into this process, that had already been kind of given out. And Henry Feingold said, but we're really looking for somebody to do the 1820, 1880. And I did think pretty long and hard, do I really want to do that? I don't feel like, in a way, there had been so little really good scholarship on that period, a lot of nitpicky little community histories, but I had some very fixed ideas about who those people were, and they didn't interest me, and but I agreed to do it for all sorts of reasons. And I would say almost immediately when I started getting into that material, and I kind of read every one of the community histories that had been written before, and pretty much every one of the synagogue histories, just to start getting a kind of scope. I mean, I don't think there was a single book I looked at that didn't have the word peddlers in it. And it was like they just kept showing up over and over and over again, pretty much uninterrogated. And it was just sort of seemed to be, well, they were there and that's who they were. And then they started being something else. Okay, they stopped being peddlers and they became shopkeepers. They stopped being peddlers and they whatever. And it already entered my consciousness that this is kind of really an unusual story. And it's unusual in large measure because of the kind of work that most people pursue, men or women, and certainly most of the occupations that immigrants, regardless of where they were coming from, did did not bring them into the home of, shall we say, the insiders, the majority population, the settled population, even if eventually I realized that writers, but they were immigrants as well. But what an interesting thing to contemplate how this occupation served as a kind of entree for Jewish immigrants, Jewish immigrant men, into kind of deep knowledge of American culture, what people liked, how to talk to them, what they ate, how they spoke to each other, how they furnished their homes. And ironically, the thing it reminded me of was, either you or maybe the listeners or viewers of this, I don't know that my second book was actually not an American Jewish history, but it was a history of Irish immigrant women. And
I'm aware.
Yeah. Okay. And again, so there was a group in which nearly all, I mean, it's, perhaps nearly all is a little overstated, but an enormous percentage of the women who were the predominant, it was a heavily female migration, came to the United States to do domestic work. In some ways, the peddlers were very much like the domestic servants, in that they're an immigrant population that are, in a sense, dropped into the living spaces of residents of their new home, their new country. So the Peddler book really came out of that 1990s, 1992 time for gathering. So, you know, in your question, you said, you used the word economic history, and I've come in this, as in many other terms that we use, to say that that word conceals more than it reveals, right? Because economics is not just, okay, how much was my paycheck? Okay, and who gave it to me? But what is the interaction, the impact of that entity which paid my salary, and how does it impact my life? How does it shape the way I engage with other people? But since this would be probably true for almost any project, but as an immigration historian, which is probably what I first and foremost consider myself to be, we know that migrations occurred for economic reasons. People left places of dwindling opportunity or dwindling possibilities for a particular class of people, usually the young, some segment of the social structure, never the top, never the very bottom. Okay, dwindling opportunities in those places, and dwindling opportunity in terms of those people who could not take advantage of or didn't, well, let's say couldn't take advantage of new opportunities at home, let's say leaving the rural area and going to the city, or going to work in a factory, that those are the, you know, kind of classic migrants. So yes, it's economic, but within that word, encoded in that word economics, is just about everything about their lives, what they can afford to eat, what they can afford to wear, how many pairs of shoes they can own, what those shoes mean to them.
So yeah, who they interact with, Jew, non-Jews, and the gendered relationships that they have.
Yeah, so I mean, the economic sphere is for the peddlers. Again, they were men, and they had no choice if they wanted to succeed in this venture. And to succeed was to earn enough money so they didn't have to do it anymore, and that they could lead a more sedentary life and reunite their families, get married. That success depended on interactions with people who were very different than themselves, and who they didn't, in first blush, share language, didn't share institutions, didn't share beliefs, common texts. Yes, there's a really important point there, that the peddlers were men, and the kinds of stuff that they sold were the kinds of things that women bought. So they weren't selling.
They were the ones at home, right?
Yeah, they were ones at home, and the peddlers weren't selling farm equipment, or they weren't selling wagons. They were selling pots and pans and sheets and pillowcases and blankets and curtains and picture frames and all the stuff that goes into the home, and mirrors, eyeglasses, and so these are the kinds of material objects that women, you know, were the that women consumed. I mean, there were some great little details on because one of the goals was to try to tell this not just as an American story, but to give it a New World context. And I don't know, again, if this is just being heard or people are seeing it, but I do have the air quotes for New World, because obviously these worlds were not new. People had been living there for millennia. It was just new to Europeans.
New to them.
So that was part of the project here, and that in a lot of places where in Central America, in the Caribbean, where peddlers were selling to the populations of plantation workers, they would sell, the women would bought suspenders and neckties and handkerchiefs for their husbands. And so in a way, the women serve as the gatekeepers, not only to the family's consumption, but to their husband's appearance. Right. And none of the sources give us that much insight into the reasons the women bought these men's furnishings. But, you can almost get a kind of sense that they wanted their husbands, when they went into town, to look nice and to not, come, drag themselves into town in their work clothes, but to come on Sunday to church or to some family gathering wearing a necktie and suspenders, and in a work situation in which they lack dignity. I mean, they were the bottom of the labor forces, plantation workers. But the wife is going to ensure that in public her husband has dignity, and the clothes made him a man, made him a dignified man. So I was really interested in how, again, what seemed like just an occupational history was a history about, it was ventures into the lives of the peddlers, the customers, and perhaps what I think deserved more attention is the lives of the family members of the peddlers, the wives and children, and they kind of trot up from behind, and I didn't.
Oftentimes, they're not even in America yet.
Yeah. So, but in a way, they do have lives there. I think that one could, in terms of some of the things that are missing, I think that the family members of the peddlers, I think, would be really important, and certainly in some cases, the family, the wife, and the children were in the United States, but they were left in a big city. And during the week, the peddler did his route.
Along the frontier, yeah.
Yeah, and then he came back either for the weekend or he came back, a couple times a year during not quote during the holidays, but also these were times to get good, to get stock.
Yeah.
So what did that mean when he showed up? When he came back, she's been alone without him for 5 days, okay, or for several months. And what happened? I mean, there was one comment by the child of one of these peddlers. They said they fought all the time. And, you had, again, there was just like, crept out, she was used to being kind of in charge and not having a man there who was trying to reassert authority.
You've shown is that peddling is much more than an economic history. It's a transnational history. It's a gendered history. It's a cultural history. It's a social history, maybe first and foremost. Implications. One is, what are peddling is for the peddling story, when we track the men, usually younger men with their packs, that's only a half, maybe a third or a quarter of the family's story. That peddling actually moved Jewish communities, those local histories which you mentioned, and the fact that they make it into these local histories about Columbus, Ohio, and Jackson, Mississippi, and Denver, Colorado, the implications for peddling was that once they had made it, they settled down.
I would also say that I think one of the things that to me was really fascinating about the lives of these peddlers were the religious implications. And, not so much, did they keep kosher or not, although that's certainly interesting, but it's again, that encounter with their customer. And I don't know how many of the, again, texts, documents talked about religious conversations when they slept in the customers' homes, and say, what are you? And I'm a Jew. Well, for these people who had no connection to, had no exposure, and how these peddlers have sort of become early interfaith educators.
The other way around. There's literally
that's right, and
Latter-day Saints and Millerism, the exposure to this splintering of American religious experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There was one oral history project done of peddlers. But there were a couple, but there was one that I saw where the interviewer kept asking, well, tell me about the anti-Semitism you encountered. And so I didn't. And the interviewer kind of didn't want to take that at face value. And people were nice, and anytime I, was robbed, I was robbed not because I was a Jew or had kids throw snowballs at me. It was because I was a stranger, or because of somebody with money on the road. And that again was to me really interesting. So I think in terms of other implications of the peddler story, and I don't know if this is the direction you want to go, but it's I'm interested in that transition from being a peddler to being a shopkeeper. And then there's a very different, which I think is also not just an economic history, because we know that many of these stores, particularly the early ones when the peddler is still relatively relatively modest means, those shops served as places where husbands and wives worked together. And I think one of the great unstudied issues in American Jewish history is small business, the mom and pop store, the dry goods store where, you know, the wife is behind the counter just like the husband. You know, in the cities, the grocery store, the liquor store. How did these small businesses shape, again, family, interaction with other people, you know, people of a variety of backgrounds? I mean, obviously that's very, has a very important place in the history of Jewish encounters with all sorts of other marginalized communities, or not other, with marginalized communities.
When we talk about making it and how, as much as we now know about peddling, the way that we teach when we study American Jewish history is, of course, when everybody, but the minority group who had successfully made it and transitioned past peddling opened up a dry goods store. But what did that actually look like?
That's right. And these were, I love the phrase mom and pop store, because it's exactly who worked there. And that that these become spaces of, I don't know, cooperation, conflict. And, you know, many times the children were expected to work there. So they become sites of generational, again, possible cooperation, possible tension, probably both, and resentment, and all sorts of possibilities. And the kinds of goods they sold, and again, where they decide to locate their stores, and just the whole range of possibilities are about, yeah, it's an economic history.
Much more than that.
As I went through all those community histories, one of the things I found really interesting, you know, because many of those community histories or those community biographies were very much kind of like plucked from local newspapers. You know, they would just have, you know, without a whole lot of interpretation, but just about every one of them has a place where they say that, you know, so-and-so's dry goods store, you know, would have a sign on the outside saying, oh, the store is going to be closed Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for the Jewish New Year's. Well, that tells us a kind of universe about Jewish comfort. They're not just saying, well, it's closed. You know,
the Jewish thing. They're signposting. This is our holiday. It's creating a culture.
And in a way, again, it's such a small point, but I think there's a universe of analytic possibilities in that. And
assumptions and telegraphing Jewishness.
And teaching, and they're teaching the customers, you know, this is, you know, the customers may not know what these holidays are. So I think it's a fabulous little piece of, I mean, like a dot of data that could be used, again, in a way to think about a book on small business. I mean, I'm not going to do it. I would love to have a student do that as a project.
Right. And, a new frontier of the people who made the Jewish frontier.
Yeah, and these are, you know, they're in big cities. They're obviously just stores that serve in predominantly Jewish neighborhoods. But again, Jews have businesses in African-American neighborhoods, in many of the neighborhoods of other new immigrants. What did this mean? And actually, I throw in one other thing. Now I'm really excited about the small business, although I'm not going to do it. But in many cases, we know that the merchant's family lived above or behind the store. Okay, and so that they could have it open, you know, many, many hours a day. And so, like, Mary Anson has this beautiful line in the Promised Land, where she says that the customers of Mother's store, she indicated her father had no head for business. Her mother ran the grocery store. She said customers of Mother's store on Arlington Street, if they came in, there was nobody there in the shop. They knew she was in the back turning the loaves in the oven. And so that, you know, reinforcing on the one hand women's double duty, right, that they're doing the homework and they're running the store, they're in the store. But again, it's about that these as sites of learning for the customers. And again, it's a very different kind of way of making a living than leaving your home and going to work in a factory.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.